This is the InfoSec and Olsen Show. I'm Josh Amishav. Back in the day, we all enjoyed a certain amount of privacy and probably took it for granted. As tech has advanced, though, we've willingly given up a lot of that privacy for convenience and perhaps security. Today, Nathan Sweaney joins us to talk about, among other things, the future of privacy and some of the overlooked situations where we leak data. My three main takeaways of the conversation were: 1, who's collecting our Bluetooth and Wi-Fi signals; 2, how to get your talk accepted at a security con; and 3, how we use OSINT to steal his Twitter handle from a Nazi. You'll enjoy those two things, plus a bunch of other tips along the way. Direct support for this podcast comes from BreachSense, the data breach monitoring platform. More details can be found at breachsense.io. And now, here's some conversation with Nathan. Nathan Sweaney, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Josh. Good to be here.
So, who are you and what do you do?
Who am I? So I am a principal security consultant for a company called Secure Ideas. We do security consulting. We're really well known for penetration testing, primarily in the US, but we have some international customers. We do a lot of training. That's kind of where we got our start. One of our founders used to be a SANS instructor and had done some stuff for him. And so we do a lot of offensive security consulting, I guess you might say. We help people figure out where the vulnerabilities are, where the risks are in their organization, and then how to patch those up.
Cool. So I want to talk today a bit about privacy and some of there's been a lot of talk about it. Does it exist? Doesn't exist? I want to kind of drill down into that a bit. But before we do, how do you define privacy?
That is a great question. As you were asking the question, I'm thinking, well, you got to start with a definition. Normally, I think when most people argue about does privacy exist or not, I think they're really arguing about two different definitions, or maybe three different definitions. I've always said, if you ask security professionals, if you ask three of us for opinions, you'll get 5 different opinions. Privacy is kind of the same way. A lot of people think, well, we have a legal right to privacy. You really don't. There's no, and I'm coming from an American perspective. I don't know if your audience is more global than that. There is no right to privacy necessarily in the U.S. Constitution. There's a lot of follow-up laws that define some assumptions about kind of a right to privacy, but it's just not clearly defined. For most people, I think what they really mean when they talk about a right to privacy is the right to choose some autonomy in how much other people know about them. Right? Does that make sense? I want to be able to tell you can use my data for this, or you can use my data for that, or you can keep track of me this way or that way. And if you impede on my authority or my autonomy to do that, I feel like my privacy has been violated. Is that fair?
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. But then you get these, your average mobile app, and it has some legalese that nobody really follows. You don't really know what is yours, what's not yours. Do you even own the data? How does that work in the mobile app world?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's where you have these competing ideas of privacy, because I think a lot of it is, I gave a talk at B-Sides OK a few years ago. And one of the points I made was that most people really don't want privacy. Most people want a perception of privacy. They want the idea that they have some privacy and control. And yet every single time, every study that's been done, when we look at it, people give up privacy for almost anything, right? Hey, you get this extra coin in the stupid game once a day if you give us access to this. Okay, sure. Yeah, I'll give you access to that. I've got Ring doorbells on my front door, right? That gives up a little bit of my privacy. It's being uploaded to some, but it provides a lot of convenience. So most people want that inherent concept of privacy, but when it comes down to it, really they value convenience more. They may not say it, they won't admit to it, but the evidence is there.
Okay, and as a security practitioner, if you have the doorbells, that kind of, I guess, answers the question, but where do you draw the line?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, I like to look at risk. I travel a lot. Well, not so much for the last year and a half, but prior to that, I traveled a lot. And, I would post pictures on Facebook or Twitter about being in an airport or being in this city. And, people would say something like, oh, you've got a family at home, you've got a wife and kids. Aren't you worried? It's easy to find your address. Somebody could, first off, people don't do a good job of assessing risk and trying to figure out how to mitigate what needs to be mitigated and what doesn't. But something like that, yes, there is a little bit of privacy that I'm sacrificing, but I've looked and said, okay, what is the risk here? What other controls do I have in place? Preventative controls may not necessarily be the only control preventing that information getting out there. We've got detective controls and corrective controls. I've always laughed and said my wife knows how to use the shotgun just as well as I do. So, I don't have to be there for her to defend herself. But, I mean, people inherently think, oh, I don't want to give out that information because that might be dangerous. Well, is it really? I don't know. There are times where it is. There's times where, not so much. But to me, I try to think more about what is the risk of this versus the reward, as opposed to just, I don't want to give anything out.
Okay, so there's, I guess, information like when you're putting things on say, Facebook or on social media that you're kind of voluntarily giving up. And then there is other, I don't know, call it meta data that's getting leaked, but let's say tracking of Bluetooth signals or license plate readers on highways, where you don't really have any control over that. There isn't anything you can really do, but how do you mitigate risk around that?
That's a great point. And I don't want to correct you a little bit, but it's not quite.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, it's not quite as much of a dichotomy. I think those two things play together. My assessment of the risk to myself or my family takes into consideration that these other things are happening as well, right? My having a Ring doorbell is only a problem if other people around me don't also have them, right? If my neighbor has a Ring doorbell, my information's out there. Their doorbell can watch me come and go just as often as mine watches them come and go, right? So we have this situation where now all of our data is being shared in various places. There was a great video, and I can't remember the company. There was a video that was on Twitter back when COVID stuff first happened. And the goal of the video was to demonstrate how quickly people spread. And so what it was is they showed the cell signals from a beach in Florida, and it zoomed in on the beach and you could see all of the individual cell signals. It was anonymized, but you could see these individual signals. And then the map zoomed out. And I don't know if it was a satellite. I don't know where this data collection came from, but you saw all these signals spread out and go across the country. And within like 3 or 4 days, I mean, it was all over the place. And so the point was, hey, if somebody's sick here, they infect these people, here's how quickly it can spread across the country. But when you get to looking at it, you know what? Those cell signals, that might be anonymized data. But if I see this signal come to this house and stop for 8 hours at night, and then it goes over here to this place and it's here for 8 hours, and then it comes back over here, like I can figure out who that is. I know who, I can use, that's all public data to see who owns that house, who works at this place. I can do some reconnaissance. So all of that data is out there. It's being collected. It's being used. I know a lot of, in the retail industry, a lot of places, a lot of marketing folks will collect Bluetooth signals, wireless signals, stuff like that to be able to do traffic patterns. So to see, okay, when somebody sees this particular advertisement, what is the likelihood they buy this product? And what if we move that advertisement over to this other aisle? Or what if we use digital displays instead of, stand-up signs? And they do analysis like that to determine, who bought this product. Well, that's all being correlated as well to like user accounts and, credit cards being used. That data is being collected. It's out there. So for me to say, okay, what is the risk here? I have to assume the data is already being collected. It could be breached here. It could be breached there. There's lots of ways that it could be used against me. How does that play into the additional data that I'm willing to give out? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And you had an interesting story about a friend of yours who was using Wi-Fi logs.
Yeah. So I'm trying to remember how much of this is public. So I don't know that the court records are all completely done. So I'll leave it a little bit anonymized. But a good friend of mine works at a university. He's the CISO for a fairly large private university. The police came to him and said, we want to put a tracker on your main website. We're trying to identify a particular user, and we want to put this little bit of code so when he visits, we can get a ping and get access to his device. And he's like, well, for various reasons, he couldn't do that. But then he started asking me, like, what are you looking for? What is it you're trying to get? He's like, well, there's this situation. It ended up being a serial rapist on campus. And they didn't know that at the time. There were some reports of assault. But they said, we know this person has been in these certain rooms at this certain time. We'd like to track him down. And he said, oh, that's easy. We've got Wi-Fi logs. So like all of campus is covered by Wi-Fi. They went and this person hadn't even connected to the Wi-Fi, but there were logs of, seeing the MAC addresses based on various access points. So they were able to say, okay, in these 3 particular places where this attacker was known to have been, there's only one Wi-Fi MAC address that was in all of them. And, oh, here's the other place where he's at in this particular dorm room. And so they were able to go in and it was an international student at the time. He was out of the country. So they got a warrant. They went into the room. found his devices, found evidence of crimes, and enough evidence to confirm that he was a serial rapist, and then we're able to arrest him and all that. Now, that's a good thing, right? We say, hey, the serial rapist is off the street, and we all look at that and say, yeah, that's great. I'm glad that happened. But we also have to think about what's the downside. If I can track a bad guy like that, that means I can also track anybody else I want for really any reason I want. So anytime we start talking about these large collections of data, that's really the question, is who has access to it and what can they do with it? It's interesting. Have you seen or had any discussions about the Apple CSAM conversation going on?
No, and that's another great topic to bring up.
Okay, yeah. So I'm just flying off the cuff here. So the argument is Apple's suggestion was, if you're not familiar, CSAM is child sexual abuse material. So we used to call it child porn. I was told recently that the reason they call it CSAM is to take away any concept of whether or not it was, I can't think of the right word, mutual, like whether the child it doesn't matter whether the child had any involvement in it or what.
There's consent.
Yeah, the consent doesn't matter, right? It's sexual abuse no matter what, because it's a child. So Apple said, hey, we have this program we want to roll out, we've developed, and we're going to take hashes from law enforcement, and we're going to scan every text message that comes through, iMessages, I think it was. And if any of them match this hash, I'm simplifying it. It's a little bit more complicated than this. But effectively, if we see matches in the hash, we know this is evidence of a crime. We'll turn that over to the authorities. And of course, people are up in arms, and there's a lot of reasons. There's some definite good sides and there's definite downsides. But the question I have is, okay, who controls those hashes that get sent? Right now, that's being used. Ideally, that's what it's being designed for, is CSAM. But what if somebody with enough authority in the government says, you know what, we want to find everybody who shares this particular image that's being shared among this particular radical group, right? Technically, the same system can be used. Apple wouldn't even have to know about it. The government could just slide that in as a CSAM material under the same label and then identify those devices, those people. So there's a lot of room for abuse that, and then it came out, Apple mentioned, oh, by the way, anybody that's uses, is it iMail or whatever their mail system is, their cloud mail, we've been already doing this for all of your email for the last 3 years. Like they just kind of slid that under, and it's like, oh wait, what? I do have a Mac. I have, I guess, 2 Macs considering my Mac Plus here, but I'm not a huge Apple fan, so I don't care much either way. But there's definitely concerns there about that whole process.
Yeah, and there was another interesting story that came out today from out of Kabul that ISIS has taken over biometric databases of Afghanis that were helping the Americans. Oh. And now they have access to it, and they can then figure out who, against them in Afghanistan. So maintaining these biometric databases have a lot of ramifications for future political changes that can happen.
That is a great point. I hadn't seen that article yet. That's interesting. There was, I think it was a couple of years ago, I don't remember if it was watches or what, but the running, there was a website that kept track of where people ran and their patterns and stuff like that.
Oh, Strava,
that's what it was. And it's like you could tell, oh, here's these people that ran around this track on this military base, and you could keep track of where they were and when they were coming in and out, and obviously some concerns there. And I saw something similar. I don't remember if it was Strava or I want to say it was a Google Watch or something, where the police basically were able to subpoena this user's data and found out that he ran past a house where some particular crime was performed, and they arrested him based on that. Now, it turned out he was innocent and whatnot, but he was in prison for a while because they had that data that was uploaded from his biometric device. That kind of stuff is terrifying. I mean, I get it. Again, there's value there, but to the Taliban thing, one of the things I always tell people is I'm not so much concerned about, when I agree to your terms of service, or if I agree to upload data to you or here, I'm not so much worried that the person that I'm trusting, the company I'm trusting, that they're going to do something malicious. Some will. Some are just stupid. Some are negligent. But I think generally most professional business people have good intent. But what happens when that company gets bought by somebody else? Their agreement with me, whether it's a social contract or a formal terms of service or whatever, that goes out the window, right? How are they going to use my data after that? There's no way to know that for sure.
Yeah, and we see that also just on the ransomware side.
Yeah,
these stuff all the time. You've got companies that, and it's internal, right? They're not letting it out, but it was stored in plain text, and then it becomes public on some ransomware gang's website, and your data's out. Nothing you can do.
It's really interesting if you look at the marketing companies that are buying, like the data brokers, they buy and sell data that a lot of times people wouldn't think would be that useful. But, like I can understand somebody wants to keep track of what I purchase, where, and all that kind of stuff. But think about like my travel data. If as I go around a city, like I said before, I travel a fair amount. Every time I drive by a McDonald's, their free Wi-Fi is going to capture my MAC address. Every time I'm in an airport or, on an airline or in a hotel, all of that data is being collected. Now, I've been told, I can't verify this, but I've been told by some people that I trust that some of these data brokers are actually buying that log data that just shows where people have been. If that's true, the amount of data being collected, I struggle to imagine this, partly because I don't want to admit it. But if that's true, there are companies who have access to pretty much everybody's travel anywhere they go. And imagine like when we start looking at machine learning and AI stuff, imagine if we could take that data and say, okay, this person's device went past all of these places here. We can look and say, oh, wait, look, all of the company execs from this company 3 times in the last year have flown over to this other city where their main competitor is and have, been in the vicinity of their offices. Maybe there's a merger getting ready to happen there, right? Like you can start analyzing and say, oh, look, hey, this person's device, who according to public records is married to this person, their device is spending a significant amount of time over here in the vicinity of this other person that they work with after hours, late nights, stuff like that. You can start to identify, hey, maybe here's somebody that I can extort for various things. Like there's a lot of ways that data could be abused. It's just a matter of who has access to it and what their intent is.
So from a defensive perspective standpoint, what do you suggest you do?
Crickets here. I don't know. I honestly, so like the talk I gave at B-Sides a couple of years ago, I used the statement, privacy is dead. And everybody's like, oh no, privacy is not dead. I'm like, no, really, privacy is dead. Like what we know as privacy, what my parents described as privacy, 30 years ago, that's dead. It will not be back. Technology has killed it. I don't see any policy. I mean, we can put regulations in place and whatnot. We can put precautions in place. I've got a friend who is very paranoid, and all of his family have cell phones that have been de-Googled, right? Like they're Android phones that are using a non-Google version of Android. They don't have any of the services. They've got, I think they have hardware switches to turn off Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and all that stuff, and they don't turn them on unless they need it. I tell him, hey, you're still being tracked by your cell signal. Like you can't get rid of that. But he's very paranoid about all that stuff. And I pointed out to him, I was like,
I hope they have anonymous SIMs.
Anonymous SIMs. Yeah, that's the question, right? Like it's being tracked somewhere. But I pointed out to him, like, you are at the point where you are the anomaly, right? So again, I'm let's think 5 years in the future, right? We've got AI that's advanced a little bit further. We've got all of this data collection. If it could be centralized and managed by machine learning, we are nearing the point where the signal that can't be identified, hey, we see a signal here. We don't know who it is, but we can track it back to a certain house, or we can say, here's where it went off the grid and here's where it came back on the grid. Like those types of people are going to be the ones that stand out. And at that point, you're being tracked by your lack of having trackable information. We're not there yet. I don't think this isn't a like, oh my gosh, the sky's falling and things are really bad, but I think it's progressing more quickly than people realize. The Amazon Sidewalk stuff, you know what I'm talking about with Amazon Sidewalk?
No, tell us.
Oh, okay. So Amazon announced about a year ago, I think a little over a year ago, that all of their devices were going to start using, I don't remember if it's like Zigbee or Z-Wave, or it might be Bluetooth, I don't know, but some signal to communicate directly together and share internet connections if the signal they currently have is not strong enough. And the idea is, if I put a Ring device on the side of my house that's furthest away from my access point, it might be stronger for it to connect to my neighbor's doorbell and use that internet connection than to come through mine. It's basically, they've created a massive mesh network. Now, at this point, you can go in and turn it off and all that kind of stuff. But what it does is Alexa devices, all of the smart home stuff. I mean, at some point, even cars and all that, they're all part of a large network sharing data back and forth. So, take that to the next step. Think about like vehicles, right? when we have cars that have all these cameras and sensors and all that, they're collecting all this data and they're all networked together. There's a ton of data that's going to be able to be collected and used and all that kind of stuff. I don't see a possible way that anybody would be able to completely go off the grid, you know?
Yeah, I was going to add drones to that, which is another topic. I don't know. Seems to be there's no way to protect against that, at least for the average individual. Perhaps a hose.
Yeah. Well, even that. It's actually, so flying above your property, even if, a lot of people say, oh, this is my property. If I see a drone, I'll shoot it down. That's illegal. You can't do that any more than you can shoot a car that's driving, past on the street.
And like, depending on the height, are you going to hit it?
Or are you going to hit it? Where's it going to crash? There's all kinds of things there. I had a conversation a couple years ago. I happened to be, Jim Bridenstine, he used to be the administrator of NASA for several years. He lives here close to me, and we happened to be in the airport at the same time, waiting on a plane. And he was flying to some type of seminar discussion thing where they were talking about drone regulations. And most people think NASA, they think space. They don't think about National Aeronautics and Space Administration, right? So he was saying in the same way that, I can't remember who's in charge of like highway safety and stuff like that. But basically, FAA is in charge of flights and commercial flying and planes, stuff like that. But NASA, I guess, has some level of authority for drones and figuring out the regulations and whatnot there. And so one of the things that he told me, which kind of surprised me, was there are tons of companies that have their manufacturing is ready to go. Their equipment, the technology is ready. They're ready to start putting drones in the sky as soon as all of that's worked out. Which, think about like where you drive, the path that, we have roads, and before that we had paths. That's been building up for hundreds of years. We had horse-drawn buggies, and then that developed into cars, and then we got, paved highways. But we don't have the same type of system for figuring out the right of way for a drone. There's no highway system for drones and UAVs. There's no emergency, hey, the police need to take over this airspace to deal with some situation. There's no process for that right now. They're working on that and trying to figure out how to do it. But as soon as that happens, like as soon as that's all formalized, I think we're going to start seeing, hundreds and thousands of drones in the sky at all times, because the ability for me to send a message, right? If I have to wait for FedEx to come pick something up and take it somewhere, as opposed to if I can just stick it out on my back porch and have a drone pick it up and take it across town, the potential there is huge. It'll be interesting to see. But yeah, back to our main point about data collection. Imagine when, law enforcement has several dozens of drones monitoring everything at all times, right? They don't need to chase somebody who's speeding. They just follow it with the drone traffic and then meet the person where they're going. That's
definitely
crazy.
A game changer.
Yeah.
So I want to pivot a bit and talk a bit about B-Sides. For those who aren't familiar, what is B-Sides?
Okay, so I don't remember the year it started. Several years ago at Black Hat, which is one of the big security conferences in Las Vegas every year, a bunch of people didn't get accepted. A bunch of really good talks didn't get accepted. And some of those folks said, you know what, Black Hat's gotten too corporate. Like, let's start our own thing. And so, those of you who are old enough to have like a cassette tape, you had the A side and the B side. B-Sides was designed to be the B side of the conference, right? Black Hat's over here. It's happening at Caesar's Palace, I think, at the time. And B-Sides over here, and it's free. And we're just going to hang around a hotel and have a good time. Very informal, very much focused on practical education and knowledge. From there, it just blew up. Like it went so well that somebody else said, hey, let's do it at RSA. And then, somewhere else. And it just kept expanding and expanding. Today, there's a small group of folks that kind of help maintain and manage kind of the international organization. They just provide guidance and structure as much as possible to the local orgs. I just went blank. I can't remember Jack's last name. Jack Daniels. Jack Daniel has been the driver of that for the longest time. He's an amazing guy that's put so much work into that. But he's kind of been the main guy keeping the ship running at the top level. And really what they do is they empower local organizations, local groups of volunteers to host a conference. So I help run B-Sides OK, which for some reason we're OK instead of Tulsa. Goes back to kind of when we started. Most of them are city specific, but B-Sides OK is kind of the Oklahoma version of a B-Sides conference. This is, I think 2022 will be our 8th year. And we went from like 100 people at our first one. Last year was kind of crazy, but I think we got the last one we did in person before COVID. We got up to almost between 500 and 600 people, which it's pretty big for a conference like that. But it's completely, well, every B-Sides is different, right? Because it's all done by volunteers. They're all done in different cities. They have to decide, what can we afford? Do we charge for the conference or not? What do we provide? How many talks do we have? But it's really a great thing. A B-Side's okay. We do it completely free. We've been blessed to have a lot of vendor money that's willing to come in and help sponsor the con. So it's a really good time. It's one of my favorite conferences to go to, just to, because it's all volunteer based. We're all there for fun. There's no corporate junk.
Are you involved in the talk submission process or acceptance process?
Yeah. So we have a group, and honestly, one of the things that I think has been extremely successful for us is we have a group of 7 core organizers, kind of our board, that drive it, and we all like each other. We actually officially formalized as an organization a couple years ago to be a nonprofit, but instead of having official bylaws and rules and all that, we've got one rule: don't be an ass. And basically, if everybody else in the group decides that you're an ass, you're out, and we replace you. It's kind of we try to be pretty informal, but this is fun for us, right? It's not a job. We're here to have a good time, and so we want to keep it as simple as possible. But what we do is our conference is usually in April. So every fall we put out a CFP, people submit to it, and then we go through and review those. We've always got sponsors that say, hey, we're going to give you so much money, we want to talk. And we say, go suck an egg. You can't buy talks. I don't want to say it's completely blind, because we've got a lot of speakers that have been there year after year and have really put in effort to help make our conference what it is. And we know they're good speakers. And so if they submit, we give them a little bit more preference.
Okay, so let's talk about the ones that I guess have less experience.
Yeah.
From your perspective, what can people do to improve their chances of getting accepted to a con?
Oh, great question. So a lot of times people get so bogged down in, my idea is so great and wonderful and everybody needs to know about it, that they don't think as much about how it appears to other people. And this is true just in general with security presentations and the way security people tend to be really technical and don't always have that business acumen to be able to present their ideas in ways that will be taken well. So one of the things to think about is, as you're drafting your submission, think about somebody that doesn't know anything about your topic and present it in a way that will be interesting to them. Because we have blue on our board, we have blue team people, we have red team people, we've got developers, we've got people with lots of different areas of experience. Some are management. And so certain topics will really stand out to them and say, hey, this sounds great. Others will be like, I don't have a clue, but looking at that submission, it sounds worthless. So think about, don't use acronyms that aren't clear what they mean, right? If it's something niche to your area, describe it. It helps to provide some, if you have room. It depends on the CFP process, because every conference is different, but go through and explain, here's why this is important. Don't just assume we know it's important. Say, I think, this is a big deal. People need to know about it. Here's some relevant news articles or whatever. Give the abstract that we're going to use to market it. We usually ask people to have, 2 paragraphs or something that is going to go in the website and the marketing material. And that needs to be written for the end user, for the person who's coming to the con. They need to be able to read that and within 10 seconds say, ooh, I want to go to that talk, or I don't. Right. But then beyond that, give a more detailed explanation to the CFP reviewers. Ideally, if you can have an outline, hey, I know I've got a 45-minute window. I'm going to spend this much time on this much time on this much time on this. And here's my outline and my topics. That, to me, that separates the difference between I've really thought this out and I have a good idea of what my message is, versus I have this idea that I want to rant about, but I haven't really thought it through yet. And I'm probably going to write the talk the night before. Because we get a lot of that, right? It's like, all right, this clearly might have been a good idea, but they just threw it together at the last minute and it's not nearly as good as it could have.
Great advice. Where can people, if they want to learn more about you, where can they find you?
So I am either blessed or cursed to have a very unique name. I'm the only Nathan Sweaney in the world. So if you can spell my last name correctly, I'm easy to find on Google. I'm at Sweaney on Twitter. I've got a hilarious story about how I confiscated that handle from a neo-Nazi.
How'd that happen?
So I don't know how much time we have. Short version is, the guy, it wasn't being used anymore, the handle, right? It's the only reason I even considered this. But with Twitter, when you go to say, I forgot my password, it asks you, it says, we're going to send an email to this email address. And it's, a couple letters and a bunch of stars, and then a couple letters, a bunch of stars, .com or whatever. In this case, I was able to look at the dude's profile information, and it had some Aryan, neo-Nazi references, whatnot. And I was able to look at that on some other sites and saw another domain that looked like it was in the San Francisco area that was, again, neo-Nazi related, whatnot. And it just so happened that when I looked at the Twitter forgot password stuff, it matched this other domain that was also tied to the guy's other information, basically just doing, open source intelligence kind of stuff. Based on that, then I thought, okay, well, what I went to look to that domain, and it said this isn't active anymore, and it hadn't been active for a few years. So then I went to Google and just said, hey, can I register this domain? And they said yes. And at that point, I had a moral quandary. We've got thousands of years of, what do they call it when like a shipwrecks and we go through and salvage. We've got thousands of years of law and moral discussions on salvage process and what's allowed and what's not and how that fits. What's the law and what's really not beyond the law, because there's no law? What is the moral ramifications of confiscating a Twitter handle that's not being used? Technically, it's a violation of Twitter service, because when I click forgot my password, I am not that person, right? And so I'm trying to take over something. So what I ended up doing was, first off, I registered the domain just to make sure I could get it. And sure enough, I was able to. I sent a bunch of emails to other messages, to other things around whoever this previous owner was, and just said, hey, if you want this back, I'll give it to you. But at that point, it hadn't been used for like 5 years. And I said, if you want this back, I'll give it to you, blah, blah, blah. We're going to wait and see. I put a message on the website, just on the base, saying, hey, I registered this. Here's my intent. I'm going to take over this Twitter handle. If you want this back, I'll give you 90 days. And I waited 90 days, and then he didn't. And then I went through the process. I think I private messaged him on Twitter as well to see if they, I say him, I don't know who it was, but to see if they responded, and no response. And then so finally I did the forgot password thing. It sent me an email at this new domain, and I was like, okay, I changed the password. And then I did the next step. I basically went and posted a tweet on that name saying, I'm going to give you 90 days. If this is yours and you want it back, let me know. And he didn't. And so after another 90 days, then I went through and said, okay, this is mine. But then it's interesting because I've got like, I don't remember at that time, a couple thousand followers on my other handle that I was using. And I wanted to move them to this one. And I was like, how do I do that? I don't want to just tell people, come follow me over here. Well, it turns out on Twitter, you can change your handle if nobody's using the one you want. So what I did was I deleted @Sweaney. And I did this very quickly because I didn't want somebody to scoop it and take it. But I deleted @Sweaney. And then I switched over to my other one and just changed it from, I don't remember what I had, to @Sweaney. And then I went back and recreated my old one and then posted a message on the old one saying, hey, if you're trying to find me here, I've moved to @Sweaney. And it went seamless. It was really great. So
only took 6 months.
It took me 6 months, but one of the things that Secure Ideas, our trademark is professionally evil. And we put a lot of emphasis on that professional part of the moral and ethical decisions of, we're breaking into stuff, like people are trusting us with their most sensitive data. I stole $3 million worth of gift cards one time from a clothing store, and there was no authentication. Like I could be dressed very, very nicely if I want. You guys can't see me, but I'm wearing a t-shirt. I'm not dressed nicely right now, but like in our business, we have to set ethics above everything else. And so it was important to me that, if nothing else, for my own conscience and for the appearance of people that I work with, they needed to know that if I'm going to steal this name, I'm going to do it the right way and try to give I tried to follow the guidelines that we've used for salvage in other domains, and I think I was fair about it. And a neo-Nazi lost the domain. So that's,
yeah, that takes a tremendous amount of patience.
Yeah. It did that.
That's very impressive.
Anyway, your question was, where can people find me? That was a long way to say I'm @Sweaney at Twitter. Nathan at secureideas.com. People can find me there too. bsidesok.com. If you're in the Oklahoma area or surrounding states and want to be involved, we'd love to have you.
Awesome. But I was setting you up for that story, by the way.
That's great.
I thought it'd be great. All right, Nathan, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks a lot, Josh.
All right, that's it for this week. Thanks again for listening and leaving reviews. If you have any comments or questions, I'd love to hear from you. I'm at Jamoose on Twitter, or drop me an email at podcast@breachsense.io. And if you're part of a security team that needs visibility into your employees, customers, or third-party suppliers' breach credentials before criminals exploit them, head on over to breachsense.io to apply for a free 7-day trial. Thanks for listening. I'll be back in your earbuds next Thursday morning.